On Sunday, the world celebrates the end of World War I, 100 years of it, of the so-called Great War, which started on December 11th on 1918. In Paris, it was stopped after 4 years of war, with victory of France and its allies, and the loss of Germany. That settled the basis for World War II to start. In that same train wagon, after France's occupation, Hitler obliged the French generals to surrender. The chaotic world inherited from 1918 has similar aspects with the present situation of the right wing and the extremism in today's world. What was the geopolitical consequences of this war? Our analysis in Jugada Crítica. On Sunday, the presidents of France and Germany will attend a concert at the Strasbourg Cathedral as a show of good relations between friends and foes, between those who were friends and foes at World War II, to celebrate the first 100 years of the end of World War I. President Macron invited more than 80 presidents from different countries which were directly or indirectly involved in this war. Trump rejected this invitation. President Macron was hoping for President Trump to reconsider its decision to step back from the IMF treaty. If you ask me, I don't share the fascination of new superpowers for abandonment of freedom and love for nationalism. We can buy a new 21st century based on multilateralism, responsible multilateralism focused on results, strong multilateralism. This needs the participation of the US, who have an important role in the development of a free world. We hope they help us to preserve and reinvent peace. Let's check some of our websites. We go to Emisoras Unidas, which show the first peace treaties that have been done after World War I. The most powerful forces signed 16 peace agreements. The first one put an end to the battles in the East Front, but Russia lost a lot of its territory. Also, we have the Versailles Treaty, signed in 1919 in the Palace of Versailles, which ended the war between Germany and the Allies. The third treaty was signed also in 1919 between the Allies and Austria, and this dissolved the empire that has 7 centuries of age, and it originated half a dozen of states, of new states. Another treaty signed between the Allies and Bulgaria in 1919, in a moment in which war was in favor of Germany, but it transformed the borders of different countries like Yugoslavia. Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory. The Ottoman Empire was dissolved too with this other treaty and stopped the war between Armenians, Greeks and French. Now we go to read the article published in the website Marxist.com of Alan Wood, Yeah, talks about the peace created to end more peace. The secret of the negotiations room, the leaders of the civilized world, they bargained as salesmen in a medieval market and divided Europe and the entire world according to their interests. This prepared the basis for conflicts that happened later directly in the Second World War.
Así es como se dividieron Europa y el mundo entero en esferas de intereses. Este hecho
This prepared the base, as we said before, for future conflicts that created World War II. The Versailles Treaty created the League of Nations, an organization that tried to mediate international conflicts and trying to prevent future wars. But their leaders prepared arms races and different conflicts. Lenin considered the League of Nations as a hole of crooks, and then with time Lenin was proved right. Now we go to our correspondent Hansel Oro in Russia. He will update us on the coming commemorations that will take place in Europe because of the first 100 years of the end of World War I. Welcome, Hansel. Hello, Rolando, and our audience. On November 11th, in France, they will celebrate the signing of the Armistice of the German Empire. The United States also participated, but later in this First World War. This war was caused by the killing of Archduke Francisco Fernando in 1914. And then Austria declared war to different powers. The alliance was formed by Austria, Germany, and Italy. And then there was Russia, Great Britain, and France on the other side. On June 28 of 1919, 5 years after the killing of the Austria Archduke, and talking from the political point of view, the Austro-Hungarian Empire caused its dissolution, dissolved also other countries. Russia and Italy dissolved the monarchy of Nicholas II. This happened in the beginning of the 20th century, and I'm talking about now we're talking about the socialist revolution with the Bolshevik party ahead. They became very strong after the awareness of lower classes and worker classes and campesino classes. This came after the First World War, and they continue to consider this after finishing the empire of Nicholas II Tsar. We can say that this world never ended because on the Versailles Treaty, where they blamed Germany for the war, and where Hitler was already present as a character. And it was the beginning of his political career until he became the Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Well, all of this then created the World War II. These 100 years of the armistice signed in France is important in this current context because the US President Donald Trump is supposed to participate in this, also President Vladimir Putin. Trump has started threats to abandon the INF treaty, which could put the world at risk of nuclear war. Russia has rejected this and asked the US to not step out of this treaty. Also, the United Kingdom and France have made that call, and they also call for denuclearization around the world. Thank you, Hansel, for this. And it happens that the US President finally rejected the invitation to participate in these celebrations. He won't be present in the celebration for the 100 years of the end of World War I. Now we go to Washington with Alina Duarte. Alina, what have been the first reactions regarding the rejection of Trump after the invitation made by France's President Emmanuel Macron, in a moment in which the world expects dialogue between Trump and Vladimir Putin to try to save the nuclear weapons agreement to be successful? Okay, Rolando, as you said, he won't be present in this Sunday's event. President Donald Trump has been very criticized, not only to now after these decisions. Let's remember that his administration has been a unilateral administration based on unilateralism. As I told you before, he decided to step out from this treaty unilaterally. Months ago, in May, Trump decided to step out of this treaty, despite the opposition of other presidents. The objective of this forum is meant to remember the countries not to follow the same mistakes that caused World War I. But months ago, President Trump planned a military parade of $1 million military parade, and he was criticized by US citizens and different media outlets. And Trump said that he'd rather not spend so much money in that parade, reason for which he was gonna go to this commemoration of the end of World War I. But then he rejected it. Now it's expected to see what happens in regards to meetings with Vladimir Putin. After the midterm elections, President Trump has been very busy. However, he was not able to win any of the two houses. The House of Representatives is now property of the Democratic Party. And after this, different of the policies of Trump will be defined. Now, the multilateral issue, it's something in which Trump hasn't been very bright. His speech is based on sanctions, which are actually economic measures taken unilaterally against Iran, against Venezuela. And this meeting in Paris will take place a week after the US reestablishing sanctions unilaterally against Iran, and after the decision of retiring from these peace treaties. Let's see what happens in the next weeks with the Senate and House of Representatives in its majority Democrat. Let's see if this will limit Trump's policies. People have expectation in regards to this. This will affect the decision taking on migration policies and foreign policies. Let's see how will this affect our countries in Latin America in regards to the sanctions against Cuba and the situation in Nicaragua and Venezuela. Let's see how this develops in the next days.
Alina, llama la atención que el presidente estadounidense se retira de este tratado nuclear. Sin embargo, está impulsando conversaciones con Corea del Norte.
He has promoted conversations with North Korea for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. This week, Mike Pompeo was supposed to meet with North Korean representatives. This was also suspended. How do you interpret this double standards of the United States versus nuclear weapons? Well, this is one of the things that we have talked with several analysts here. What they say Donald Trump is pretending is trying to delete everything related to Obama. The great achievements, the nuclear agreement with Iraq lasted more than 1 year and was acknowledged as one of the main achievements of the Obama administration. Donald Trump insisted that it wasn't functional without any proof and said that Iran was violating these agreements, and therefore they had to revise first in a period of 90 days and then 6 months, where sanctions were reimposed. And what caused our attention, as you mentioned, is this policy towards North Korea, which must also be taken very carefully, because let's remember that that zone in Japan, South Korea, the United States has deployed more than 50,000 militaries, more than 50 military bases, and in spite of being in negotiations on several times, it has performed military exercises coordinated with South Korea. In its turn, North Korea has also been willing to dialogue, not only with this encounter last week, in the last weeks in Singapore, but also has freed U.S. prisoners that held in North Korea, finished with one of the nuclear reactors to continue dialoguing in these agreements. And this is something that the media in the United States is not considering, that both nations, United States and North Korea, have kept a dialogue, but this gives you an idea that while they are trying to end what Barack Obama did and try to renegotiate, which is what he said he would do in the case of Iran, he wants one of the great achievements of his administration be the negotiation with North Korea, to be able to show it as great success. It sounds very soon, but actually midterm elections were that 2 years after Donald Trump came to office. But now we are 2 years before the new presidential elections, in which Donald Trump has insisted he would be reelected, and this could be shown as one of the great achievements to negotiate and show population for the next elections. Thank you, Alina. We will go to a pause now, but when we come back, we were asking if the centenary of the end of the First World War is only in the past. What geopolitical conditions still remain to our days? We will be back to analyze this question. We continue reviewing web pages on our critical move of today, and we go to Spanish journal La Vanguardia, which shows a video on how the UK remembers 100 years of the end of the First World War. Since the last Sunday, every night, guards and volunteers manually turn on these torches as part of the celebration for the Armistice Day, the signature of the treaty that ended the First World War 100 years ago next Sunday. Beyond the Shadows is the name that this homage was received. They used to call it the Great War or the War of Wars, but it became a prelude of another, still greater war, the Second World War. The murder of Archduke Ferdinand of Austria and his wife in Sarajevo, June 28, 1914, detoned the war of Austria against Serbia and derived to the First World War. The Austro-Hungarian Empire compelled to investigate this murder to Serbian peers, but they did not accept all conditions. On July 28, 1914, Austro-Hungary declared the war to Serbia, and in July, Russia participated. The so-called World War I was not such, although it was held between 1914 and 1918 and mobilized more than 60 million European soldiers and involved 32 countries. France, Russia, Great Britain until 1917, and from there on, other countries were added. And confronted to the coalitions called Central Powers, composed by Bulgaria, Austro-Hungary, and Germany. Since 1914, the countries increased the military budget in an arms race, and this period was known as the Armed Peace. It officially ended on June 28, 1919, with the signature of the Versailles Treaty, whereby Germany accepted all responsibility for the war. The German Empire was fragmented in two by the Polish Hall. It was demilitarized, its colonies were seized and compelled to pay huge compensations. The next large-scale conflict was the Second World War. To analyze our critical move today, we will go to Spain to talk with philosopher and jurist Mayol Zanauja. Welcome to Telesur, Professor. Researchers and analysts say that wars are not only measured between winners and losers, but also by the world they are reconfiguring. In the case of the First World War, what world did they leave us? Good afternoon from Barcelona, Catalonia. As I understand it, as you say it very well, the so-called Great War later was just a prelude of the second one. There would be, in my opinion, 5 consequences that were peace treaties that supposed territorial changes, military sanctions to the losers, a political consequence, disappearance of huge monarchic dynasties, an economic consequence like inflation and impoverishment, and the United States becoming the First World War. A 4th consequence is a demographic nature, where a large number of military and civilian dead. And the 5th would be social consequences, tensions, impoverishment, and advance of extremism, which would be the egg of the serpent of what later would be totalitarianisms. One of the aspects you mentioned of these 5 consequences, the loss of human lives. More than 60 million soldiers died under weapons. But why did youth attend that war?
básicamente hay también, ¿no? En la juventud hay aquellos jóvenes que no han vivido una guerra,
There's
siempre tienen la llamada de
the
acudir a la
youth
guerra,
that
y
has
aquella
not
guerra,
lived
la
a
Primera
war,
Guerra Mundial,
always have that call.
pareció
And that
que
First World
no habría
War
muertos,
seemed
que sería
wouldn't
una
have
manera
any death
de
toll.
crecer
It
como
would be a
hombres.
way
Hay
to
muchos
grow as
jóvenes de
men.
ellos y
Many
que, como ustedes
youngsters
mismos
thought
han recordado al
so.
inicio
And
de
as
de
you
la introducción,
reminded in
en
the
la batalla
beginning
de
of this
Somme,
introduction, in Somme
muchísimos
battle,
murieron
many
y
youngsters
por eso
died,
mismo
and
luego
this is
hubo un
why
descenso
there
de la
was a
natalidad en los
decrease
años
of
venideros, de modo
natality in the coming
claro,
years.
hubo unas
So,
grandes
of
bajas
course, there
militares como
were
civiles
huge
y unas
military and
consecuencias
civilian
demográficas
death toll
terribles.
and terrible demographic consequences. Some aspects that unleashed this war were then became worse territorial tensions and even problems that became worse after the First World War. How did the reconfiguration of the European map settle? We would have to analyze that there were two bands. The Triple Alliance that you mentioned by the European, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy that had been, it not only, and then Austria against that was the aggressor nation that unleashed the conflict. And I say this because later, with the years, the disaster of the Second World War was also generated from the past, and also France, UK, and the Russian Empire also suffered changes, and many nations supported one or other side. Italy and Japan also united the Triple Entente and in definitive, more than 70 million militaries, of which 60 million were Europeans, mobilized and fought in the then largest war of history. To answer your question, I would have to say that we saw the Second World War as the reconfiguration of old alliances, and then the Allies, UK, France, Holland, and the United States, and the so-called axis of evil, Germany, Italy, and Japan. And on the other hand, Russia, that was trying to recover lost territory to implement their power as well. I would like to incorporate Vasco intellectual Iñaki Vicente. Welcome to Telesur. Iñaki, one of the consequences we have been analyzing of the First World War was the rise of nationalisms, something that had been seen since before the First World War, but that after ending the war, this was accentuated and even reached our day. Well, one of the rises of nationalism was propitiated by the development or the transit from the colonialist phase of capitalistic economy to the imperialistic phase. The analysis made from the left of what the new phase of the world capitalistic economy of authors like Hobson, Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, Bukharin, and others, each insisted that the imperialism was accentuating nationalisms and oppressions of the people. So small or large states that attended at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century were, even if there were large states, they were overwhelmed by many circumstances. They were the European states like the French and German states, and Italy, in another measure, Spain and Portugal, the states that had to overcome more pressure because the great decisive powers as Great Britain and the United States that was increasing had, and the United States had the entire South America and was expanding through Asia. England had Africa and Asia to control trade. And in these countries, Germany and Italy, contradictions and conflicts because of the expansion of the imperialist financial economy made the decade of 1910 and early 20s conflicts arise. There was a beginning of war between France and Germany, and Morocco specifically, but these nationalism ended in all of them in the First World War because of economic factors. Nevertheless, and I conclude with this, in the First World War, a new reason for bourgeois nationalism arose, which was the Soviet Union as of October 1917. In view of the danger of the Soviet Union and the international working movement, the bourgeois nationalism started evolving to fascism and very aggressive nationalism. It was not only a defensive nationalism, 1910, 1908, or the Dreyfus case in France, and in view of the fear of the working movement that could take force with the example of the Soviet Union since 1917, the European bourgeoisies, both in Great Britain and the United States and as well, promoted a bourgeois nationalism that ended in the Second World War. So, in the midst of this circumstance, Nazi fascism was consolidated. But how does this arrive to our days, for example, in Poland, a country that was also reborn as a state after the First World War? Groups linked to Nazis and appeared there.
La verdad es que no he podido escuchar muy bien lo que ha comentado, pero me imagino por dónde va.
I didn't listen very well to what you said, but I imagine what the question was. At this time, the European eastern part, like Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, etc., is having the rebirth of a fascist nationalism, not only provoked by imperialism, but also it is provoked by imperialism with millionaire investments. For example, in Macedonia, NATO's interest in expanding Macedonia and including Macedonia in NATO, but also a former policy we must analyze, what was the responsibility of the fall of the Soviet Union towards an international policy, essentially since 1930s, a little before the Second World War. The invasion of the Soviet Union to Finland, for example, the Soviet invasion and distribution with the Nazi of Poland, and then the extermination of the Katyn buses, and the defensive policy of the Warsaw Pact, and the repressive and control policy of the Soviet Union. For example, in the Prague Spring, the conflict in Poland twice, when Budapest, for example, or Berlin, there was a Soviet policy that was contrary to the policy that they had kept before with the Bolsheviks under Lenin. This new Soviet policies worsened at the end of the 50s, and that on which there is much literature, problems that remained in Ukrainian and Polish rights, and Eastern German rights that were feeling bourgeois. With those mistakes, they reached legitimacy, and when the USSR fell, one of the reasons was precisely that the problem of national rights of the countries that were inside the Warsaw Pact had not been clarified, and in this case the capitalistic system manipulated these problems that were still pending, and since the Soviet Union had not developed the first working class model, it became acute. So when the Soviet Union fell, many of these republics started to turn to right-wing nationalism by most of the committees of the committee of the communist parties that embraced the worst capitalism, the neoliberal capitalism. The Yeltsin case, for example. Yeltsin had been mayor of Moscow, and the Soviet Communist Party became, in a very short time, in the pet of Ronald Reagan, allowing them, North American capitals, to destroy the Russian economy, and defending a Russian nationalism that Lenin had criticized harshly. I think we must be responsible and assume the mistakes that were committed in order to keep them to be reproduced in other attempts of socialism. And we could also name other recent cases, but we don't have time. Thank you, Professor Iñaki, for your reflections, and Mayol for being with us from Spain. It is a time for another pause, but what political lessons did World War I leave us? What world was configured for the rest of the century that still remains until the first decades of the 21st century? We'll be back.
Our actions have an impact on the environment. It's our responsibility to change for the sake of our planet. Let's be part of this transition. Watch, preserve, and protect your Green Zone. Wednesdays, only on Telesur.
The German troops received the order of withdrawing from occupied territories in a term of 15 days, but between the signature and the effectiveness of ceasefire of the First World War, 2,500 soldiers are estimated to be killed and increased to 16.5 million people, which was the calculated death toll, although other sources talk about 30 million. The so-called Great War was one of the great slaughter of the 20th century. Besides leaving more than 20 million deceased people, this war changed geography, politics, and science. It created huge political changes and promoted the design of new borders and governance. Confrontations also left a huge economic loss because ports, railroads, roads, and crops were destroyed. European youth was massively enlisted because of the call of their governors with a promise that they would be back some weeks later. But this was one of the harshest war ever seen, and technology was used to kill and dismember both soldiers and civilians. On the July 28, 1914, people entered on horses, but 4 years later they used tanks, submarines, and aircraft. This was the first industrialized war in history with the appearance of other weapons. Rifles used in war could shoot even 20 bullets per minute. Until then, weapons could only shoot 3 per minute. In 4 years, 300 million obuses were used. Germans tested a new weapon, chlorum, and 25,000 French soldiers were killed. Phosgene was also used in 1917. The terrible mustard gas was used. The post-war brought serious critique to the capitalistic system, and many people started claiming their independence. And in this segment, we have politologist Martín Porgar, master degree in philosophy of war. Welcome to Telesur. After this analysis we have performed, according to your opinion, what are the main lessons that the First War left? Well, the First World War, in my understanding, was not a single war. It was a century of deep wars that started with this terrible industrialized war where even the mass manipulation means were perfected to seek legitimacy and for the peoples to go to the war until not only chemical weapons but war tanks and other weapons. This was a different view, but also reconfigured the European territorial map, and even the old empires, the Ottoman, the Austro-Hungarian, and the winning powers divided the territory that still are hauling problems in the Middle East. Even the Russian Empire lost territorial forces that generated these further wars. So I would say that the First and Second World War was a single war, even until the 60s, because there were decolonization processes closely related with the First, the Second World War. It's a continuous exercise of empires against the people. But in any case, the First World War was a huge test on how to industrialize the war, but it also changed the way how war was seen thereafter. We learned about fourth, fifth generation weapons for the war. Yes, the First World War created a different way of doing war at the tactical and strategic levels. To these days, this has created a series of philosophy and visions of the war called the conventional war, unconventional war, or many other names, unconventional, fourth generation. Some people even talk about fifth generation, where the planes of war talk about non-military concepts, super-military concepts, where legal, media, psychological wars intervene. Politics has been replaced by the concept of war. Nevertheless, there is also some kind of military intervention, which are the so-called humanitarian interventions, as the one they pretend to promote against Venezuela, especially, for example, the UN Secretary. But nobody is in favor of war, but they build a thought against the war, but the war is still present there. It is still legitimate and seeking ways to place one over another. And they're looking at elements like humanitarian wars, where they allegedly need to appease zones and conflicts. But can you truly appease a place with a war? Surely not. The exercise of war generates more violence, and a large part of what those who enter in conflict, winners and losers, many times are not do not agree with defeats. But this only extends conflicts. Sometimes it's not wars, but armed conflicts that, as you say, have many names, molecular wars, etc., that show that wars are not ended with other wars. It also calls our attention that more than 60 million youngsters go to that war with the hope they would be some days, and they would come back from the front. Sometimes these new types of war also
paz y tranquilidad, pero la experiencia es el caso de Libia, el caso de Irak, que eso no resulta de esa manera exactamente. ¿Cuál es su visión?
Perhaps in that vision of First World War, the governors thought that it would be short and that they would then sit to negotiate to distribute markets and natural resources. At this time, the configuration of imperialism and powers are many times aimed to create permanent chaos. The idea of invading a country to appease it and to take away human rights violators many times conceals permanent chaos configurations. And we should ask to what point the United States or the European Union or other interventionist states, what they aspire is that these countries to be appeased. A long time has passed after the Afghanistan or Libyan wars to think that they are seeking peace and stability in that zone. If it were so, we could see that those wars can be won with political negotiations. For that type of political negotiations, international organizations like ONU appeared. Yes, the United Nations, a mechanism to appease the multilateral relations. Well, United Nations was born seeking to stop conflicts since the Second World War, which was so terrible, and as prior experiments for the First World War. Nevertheless, the United Nations have authorized new wars, just because in the search for peace they want to become a world police. In view of chaos in a region, they legitimize a military intervention to seek peace. As I said, many have been appeased through political decisions, but most of these efforts have been appeased and generated more conflict, and many times they've stopped in time as the Balkans, for example, where there are still conflictive levels, they try to exploit. So these interventions have not because one of the elements of the alleged humanitarian infrastructure, and that would provide developed zones that have not been able to reach, because it calls our attention that one of the alleged purposes one of the goals is the alleged search for this peace to eliminate or take out alleged dictators. Nevertheless, they conceal the truth. Since the First World War, there are economic rivalries, economic wars, territorial distribution of the world, and competition between the large powers. Yes, it would still seem that humanity still doesn't understand these elements. Certainly, there is a reconstruction of the old wishes of market control and resource control, and these commercial wars that where Trump's proposal regarding China and the European Union against Canada and its allies established a scenario of living from imperial motives that promoted the First World War. They used murder. Yes, that was what unleashed the war, but behind was the control of resources, the late arrival of Germany to colonial distribution, conflicts between powers, and of course their bourgeoisie. It now seems to be reviving in this mercantilist game where they propose new rates, market potential. For example, the repositioning of the United States versus Latin America and its wish to veto China's and Russia's presence as a phantom that is running around Latin America when they could be perfectly international trade partners. When we read books about history of why, and you read Trump, why they came up, it seems to revive the concept. Thank you, Professor, for helping us understand that the end of the First World was not only a thing of the past. Thank you very much. If the wars offer lessons, they should be used to avoid new wars. Nevertheless, 1 century after the end of the First World War, humanity continues threatened by wars. International relations are ruled by competition and not cooperation. And the hope for a peaceful war continues threatened today because of tensions between the great powers that dispute hegemony based on national or corporate interests. Coalitions that are disguised of multilateralism, even in recent wars like the prelude of the First World War, still remain new economic rivalries, neo-colonial competition, imperialism, and its commercial war. The industrialization of death inaugurated with the First World War was also learned to self-destroy human species. For world leaders like Russian President Vladimir Putin, those who are today considered heroes of the First World War, is not only homage to great actions, but a warning that the world is frail.